Billy the Kid's legend, for most of us, starts with the gunfire. The revolver cracks, an outlaw sprints through drifting smoke, and Hollywood likes to wrap it all up with a neat, swaggering exit. But the real story, that actually starts right after the shooting stops. Now you're hunched behind a crumbling wall, sucking air through your teeth, gripping your arm or your stomach, and whatever you touch comes away sticky, red, and slick. Forget doctors. The closest thing in town is probably a barber 3 streets over, and your best shot at medicine is whatever stings the worst, whether you drink it or pour it straight onto the wound. Let's drop the curtain on the myth. In the American Southwest of the 1870s and 1880s, getting shot was just the start of your troubles. Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, William Bonney, whichever name you like, wasn't some iron-skinned movie hero. He was a teenage runaway turned outlaw, swapping sides in gunfights, dodging the law, and just as vulnerable to lead an infection as any other poor fool caught in the crossfire. Billy survived more shootouts and close calls than most, sure. He came out of the Lincoln County War alive, ducked death in Lincoln's alleys, and even managed a bloody jail escape with irons on his ankles. But every bullet wound, every knife slash, every split of skin left the door wide open to a kind of agony Hollywood never has the patience to show. Here's what we actually know. Billy was scarred. Witnesses and old testimonies repeat that word over and over. Some describe bullet or knife marks on his arms and body, not the kind of marks you wear as a badge, but the kind that mean you survived crude. Dangerous frontier medicine. The difference between living and dying wasn't grit or luck with a gun or some secret stash of miracle cures. It came down to raw luck, how deep the bullet went, how fast you could find help, how dirty your hands and rags were, and whether infection set in before you ever had a chance to limp out of town. So what actually happened when Billy the Kid took a bullet? Picture one of those alleyway ambushes, or a quick shootout behind a broken adobe wall. The shot rings out and suddenly your whole world becomes the hot, wet shock of torn flesh. Sometimes the bullet stays inside. Sometimes it rips clean through. Either way, blood starts pouring. There's no hospital gurney, no white coats. You or maybe your terrified friend have seconds to act and nothing to work with but desperation. A torn shirt sleeve, a hunk of saddle blanket, whatever rag hasn't rotted in your bags. Someone grabs the nearest whiskey bottle, splashes it on, and if Hollywood ever got anything right about the Old West, it's that whiskey was everywhere. In real life, though, whiskey on a wound burns like fire and barely sterilizes anything it's pain, not a cure. First problem, stopping the blood. Gunshots tore ugly, ragged holes, flesh tears, muscle shreds, and the bleeding is stubborn. Hands caked with sweat and dust fumble to tie a bandage. But let's be real, whatever you use will be filthy. Germs? Nobody could see them, but everyone learned to fear what they did, the hard way. And painkillers? Forget it. No morphine. No anesthesia, just more whiskey, maybe enough to make you pass out, maybe just enough to make you swear. The treatment is about as cheerful as this. Pour the booze, press the cloth, and hope you don't bleed out before it holds. This is where the legend of Billy the Kid gets a lot less glamorous and a lot more human. It stops being about shooting straight and starts being about surviving the hours after the pounding pain, the dirty rags, the gamble with infection. For Billy, living on the run, hiding in filthy rooms or riding bone-shaking trails with a fresh wound, there was always another crisis right around the corner. The real killer wasn't always the bullet itself. Sometimes it was surviving the bullet. And if you made it through the first hour, the bleeding slows, the whiskey burns, your heart finally stops hammering. You're not out of the woods. The clock starts ticking in a new way. Even when a bullet misses anything vital, it still leaves a ragged tunnel packed with grit, sweat, gunpowder, and whatever was on that filthy rag you pressed to stop the bleeding. If you've ever scraped your knee and let it get dirty, multiply that by 100, then try living out of saddlebags. Billy didn't get to lie in a clean bed and wait for a nurse. He had to move fast, sometimes hobbling, sometimes riding. Every hoofbeat or step meant the wound could tear open again, blood seeping, bandages slipping. The Old West had plenty of dust, and every bit of it would find its way into your wound. If you're lucky, your friends argue about whether to pull the bullet or leave it in. That's where the real medical advice comes out. Pour on more whiskey. If it burns, it's working. If you scream, maybe you're alive. That's honestly where bite the bullet comes from, because without anesthesia, digging out a slug or splinters was just pure teeth-clenching agony. The tools, maybe a knife that just cut bacon, or a pair of pliers last used on a horse's hoof. Step 1, lower your standards. Step 2, hope you don't die. So what came next? Now the wound is still dirty, wrapped in whatever scrap of cloth survived your escape, starting to swell and heat up. If infection sets in, the pain sharpens. The flesh gets red and angry, and pus starts to ooze yellow, green, sometimes streaked with fresh blood. By day 2 or 3, you're running a fever. Chills rattle through you. Sweat soaks your shirt, and you might find yourself shivering in the New Mexico heat. Every outlaw faced a hard choice: stay hidden and untreated, or risk crawling into town and hoping there's a doctor who doesn't care about your reward poster. Billy's world wasn't all campfires and bravado. He hid out in cramped, smoky rooms, packed with desperate men and swarms of flies. Wounds were magnets for insects, and after a few days, the smell of bad bandages, sweat, and infection was its own kind of companion. Try keeping quiet when every movement pulls a scab loose and oozes something that has no business being outside the body. And you couldn't just sit still and heal. Billy was wanted across half the territory. He had to keep moving. Riding with an open wound meant your bandage slipped, the cut reopened, and the bleeding could start all over again. If you got lucky, you only lost a bit more blood and put up with days of agony. If you didn't, the infection dug deeper. The honest truth? Most outlaws only healed because they were young, tough, and usually didn't live long enough for the infection to finish them off. Blood poisoning, bad blood, or blood fever, as they called it, was always lurking. Red streaks crawling up your arm or leg were the signal things were about to get much worse, and fast. And just to keep things from getting too bleak, let's give credit to Old West logic. Whiskey for wounds, whiskey for pain, whiskey to knock you out, and when that failed, whiskey to toast your memory. If the wound didn't get you, the cure just might, but at least you'd be too drunk to care. So, as Billy limped from one hideout to the next, survival was a daily negotiation with pain, infection, and the limits of human endurance. Every sunrise brought new aches, new fevers, and the real possibility that the bullet you survived yesterday would be the reason you didn't make it to tomorrow. And here's the kicker: you could never let your guard down. Every cough, every shiver, every foul smell meant the Grim Reaper was closer than Pat Garrett ever managed to get. That's the reality behind the legend. Outlaw life was measured not by how many gunfights you survived, but by how many hours you endured afterward. Next time you see Billy the Kid swagger away from a gunfight in a movie, remember the real miracle wasn't his aim. It was surviving the days and nights that followed, when the real battle was happening under a filthy bandage, in the dark, with nothing but grit and rot gut between you and the grave. And let's be honest about what all this did to a man's body over time. Even if Billy survived each gunfight, every limp, every scar, every fever sweat in a dirt-floored hideout was the real price of that life. Eyewitnesses describe Billy as scarred, sometimes limping from old wounds, not some mark of pride, but a reminder that every close call left something behind. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Picture him, trying to ride hard out of town with a half-healed bullet track throbbing in his leg, or crouching in a filthy corral, praying the swelling in his arm doesn't get so bad he can't pull a trigger. Every move risks tearing open a scab. Every sleepless, feverish night under a dirty blanket is a fresh gamble. Does the wound fester? Does the law catch up? Does he get too weak to run? Outlaws aged fast and died young not just from gunfire, but from the battle with infection and exhaustion. For most, a single wound meant a lifetime of pain if they got a lifetime at all. And the grim reality? Plenty didn't. The Old West is full of men who died not from the duel itself, but days or weeks later, delirious from blood poisoning, wounds turning black and sour, fever burning away their last chance. Bad blood, they called it, and there was no miracle cure, no matter how much whiskey went down or into the wound. The best-case scenario left you with a thick, ugly scar, sometimes pulling your skin so tight you could barely move that limb again. Some went on with bullets still buried under the skin, or joints that never worked right again. Hollywood loves to show Billy as untouchable, the charming kid who gets grazed, dusts himself off, and comes back smiling. But the truth? Every wound took a piece of him, whether you could see it or not. He seemed to live fast because he had to. The clock was always ticking, not just from the law, but from his own battered body. There aren't many medical charts or detailed diaries, but the silence says plenty. Most outlaw stories end with a bullet, an infection, or just a slow fade into pain and obscurity. Billy's legend survived because somehow his body kept moving, even when every mile, every fever, every limp was a reminder that the real enemies out here weren't just men with guns. They were time, filth, and pure bad luck. So next time you hear the ballad of Billy the Kid, remember, the miracle wasn't that he outdrew his enemies, but that he outlasted his own wounds long enough to become a legend. The Old West measured its heroes not by the number of gunfights, but by the number of mornings they managed to wake up, still breathing, still moving, still carrying the scars of every fight. In the end, survival was the rarest skill of all, and that's the dirty, painful, unforgettable reality hiding behind every romantic outlaw myth. If you want the real physical truth behind America's most dangerous legends, what their wounds, escapes, burials, and final hours actually looked and felt like, stick around. We go past the gunfire and into the ugly aftermath, one scar at a time.